Welcome back, Sebastian here. So today I want to kind of give an explanation on the race model that I've used in some of my recent videos. Some of those videos I've gotten some questions about what exactly the race model is. I know it's not really a mainstream, statistic or anything like that. It's basically a model that I made myself. So today I thought, why not, give kind of a really in-depth explanation, breakdown of what exactly it is, how it's calculated, that sort of thing. This is going to be a very stats heavy video, so if you're not super interested in that kind of thing, then perhaps this might not be the video for you. But on the other hand, if you really like stats numbers, then maybe you'll enjoy this video. So let's get started and kind of just talk about first kind of the kind of rationale behind why I made this model. So really, the reason I made this model was I wanted to create a way to assess race day performance. Splitting up, performances on a Saturday qualifying and performances on a Sunday in the race. And, there's a lot of conventional ways to do this. For example, just taking the points difference between a set of teammates. Or on the other hand, you can calculate the percentage of the team's points. So, for example, one driver has 80 points and their teammate has 20 points, then of course the first driver would have 80% of the team's points overall. But there are some issues with simply looking at these two statistics either in unison or in combination. So, for example, if you look at just average points gap and see how it tracks by constructor, so this is data from 2008 to 2023. And if you look at the average kind of points gap between teammates for each constructor's rank, you can see that for the constructors champion, it's over 100 points. But as you go down the scale, down the constructors order, that gap obviously increasingly goes down. Conversely, when you look at the percentages, which is on the right axis, it goes from a little bit over 50%. It's pretty consistent for the first 3 or 4 constructors positions, and then it basically goes up very, very high. And by 10th place, on average, you're looking at like a percentage difference of like a percentage where the lead driver has about 70 to 80% of the points. So again, there are some issues with simply using these statistics alone, because as you can see, depending on where the team is in the constructors championship, how those stats will act will vary quite a bit. And of course, there's other issues as well that I think we have to take into account when you talk about performance. And one of those is reliability. So I've gotten a couple of classic examples here. So the first is from 2016, and that is of course between Nico Rosberg, Lewis Hamilton, that extremely tense drivers' championship fight. Nico Rosberg, of course, won the drivers' championship that year with 385 points. No mechanical DNFs that year. Whereas his teammate Lewis Hamilton, 380 points, only 5 points behind, and he did have that one mechanical DNF at the Malaysian Grand Prix. And of course, that would have had a big effect on that of course did, I should say, have a big effect on how the championship played out that year. Now, another example, a bit more recent, from Alpine in 2022 with Ocon and Alonso. Ocon finished the season with 92 points, only 2 mechanical DNFs, whereas his outgoing teammate, Fernando Alonso, 81 points, only 11 points behind, but he did have 6 mechanical DNFs, 4 more than his teammate, and that was a pretty good car, so he almost certainly would have lost quite a few points there. So being able to take into account reliability, I think, is really important, especially when you have massive disparities between teammates. Another thing that I think we have to take into account when analyzing performance between teammates is fluke results, and this is something that's a lot more of an issue with teams that are lower down the pecking order. So, for example, 2019, Williams ran Robert Kubica and George Russell together. Kubica came out ahead on the points head-to-head, scoring a single point at the 2019 German Grand Prix. Really benefiting from the two Alfa Romeos getting 30-second penalties, whereas his teammate George Russell finished 1 place behind in 11th. And of course, the team was so awful that year they didn't score any other points that year. So if you just look at the points, Kubica had 1, Russell 0, and it would be easy to say that either they were very, very close on pace or Kubica was slightly better. But of course, for example, if you look at just average finishing position, for example, Kubica's average was 16.9, whereas Russell's was 15.5, so almost a position and a half ahead of Kubica. So that's why I think it's important to use more than one metric when you're assessing, race day performance between teammates. So just to kind of give a breakdown of the different components of the race model, and this is how it stands right now in 2020, at the start of 2025. I'm making changes right now, so in a year or so, it might be a little bit different, but this is how it stands as it is. So the three major factors or the three categories I use for the model are points, finishing position, and improvement on starting position or overtake, or their ability to overtake, as I like to call it. And I use Z-scores to basically standardize between the different categories, because obviously, finishing position, a lower number is better, whereas for points, a higher number is actually better. So of course, they're very, very different categories. So using Z-scores is a really good way to standardize between those very different categories. So I'm going to use this kind of hypothetical example here between driver A and driver B, and we're going to kind of go down each of the categories and do a really in-depth look at how this is calculated. So for driver A, this is obviously an abbreviated season. So of course, an F1 season is much longer, and traditionally my cutoff for how many races a set of teammates have to do for me to include it is about 9. Anything less than that, and I won't include it simply because it's too small of a sample size. But in our hypothetical example here, driver A, driver B, driver A finishes 4 points behind driver B. They have 56 points. Driver B has 60, but driver A has a mechanical DNF, and they also have a race where they qualify a little bit lower down the order, perhaps grid penalty, perhaps qualified out of position. Doesn't really matter too much in our example, because again, we're focusing on race day performance. But you can see, in such a small sample size, just having one mechanical DNF can have a pretty big impact. And just as well, I'm going to go over this. So the average starting position, 5.2 for driver A, average finishing position for driver A, 4, but for driver B, average starting position of 4, average finishing position 4.2. So let's kind of go through each of the categories and kind of break down how this is calculated and see, where, some of the systems I kind of built in, some of the factors I built in to kind of account for issues like mechanical reliability. So for the points, what we have to do is we have to calculate the adjusted points difference per race. And sometimes, like we saw last year with, Albon and Sargent, they only did I think it was 15 races together. So of course, if you take the raw numbers and divide that by the total number of races in the season, that's going to be a very different result than if you calculate by the actual numbers. That's why it's very important that you do this per race, on a per race basis. So to calculate this, you take the points, number of points that driver 1 scored, and then divide that by the number of races, and then you add that to basically an equation where it's the number of mechanical DNFs multiplied by the max number of points, so in our case 25, multiplied by the percentage of max constructors points. And that's a good way basically to control for how many points a driver in theory would have lost from that mechanical DNF. So for example, like I gave in my earlier example with Rosberg and Hamilton, because the Mercedes were so dominant that year, Hamilton lost a massive amount of points from a single mechanical DNF. But, on the flip side, for let's say Russell and Kubica, they're not going to lose that many points or any at all from a mechanical DNF in 2019, simply because the car was so bad that they were basically finishing outside of the points pretty much every race except that one example. So you can see how, the mechanical DNFs will have a very different effect on a driver's points total depending on where they are in the Constructors' Championship. So that's why I think it's important to control for that. And then, of course, you have to divide by the total number of races as well. And that will kind of be a driver's adjusted points per race. So you have to calculate that for driver 1 and for driver 2. So when you make that calculation, you put 56 divided by 5 plus 1 times 25 times 0.54 divided by 5. And that brings you a number of 13.9. So that's the adjusted number of points that driver 1 scored over that, 5 race season. Then you take the difference between driver 1 and driver 2, so in our case driver A, driver B, and it's 13.9 minus 12. So despite the fact that driver B ended up with more points. Remember, he had 60 originally. When you do this adjusted points difference per race, he actually ends up behind the lead driver, driver A. So 13.9 minus 12 equals 1.9. Now, like I showed you before, you can have a very different effect depending on where you are in the Constructors' Championship for just taking the raw points difference or taking the percentages. So what you do is you take both, and that generally, I think, does a good job of kind of controlling for the effect. So just do the same thing, except you can calculate the percentage this time. So you do 13 driver 1 point score divided by the sum of driver 1, driver 2 adjusted points. So 13.9 divided by and then 13.9 plus 12, and that will give you 0.536 or 53.6%. Now, I mentioned Z scores before, and if you've taken any kind of elementary statistics course at a university level, or maybe they even discuss this at high school, it's a very, you would know what this is. But for those of you who don't, it's a very common statistical test, and it's basically the number of standard deviations above or below the mean value. And the standard deviation is basically 63% of the data. That's for one standard deviation. For two standard deviations, it's about 90. I think it's like 93%, 92%, something like that. And so, of course, it's basically just a way to calculate, in a normally distributed data set, where exactly your value is. And it's calculated with the average. Let's see, what is that? The average, the value minus the average divided by the standard deviation. So for calculating the point Z score, you just take you calculate the Z scores for the average adjusted points difference per race and the adjusted percentage. You calculate those separately, and then you take the average of those two values. So in our case here, the Z score for driver 1 was 0.4008. And this is something that requires a really, really large data set to assess properly. If you only do it on a season per season basis, the data is very chunky, and it's going to be heavily influenced by what the other teammates' pairings are going to be are doing. So that's why you need to do it on a really, really large scale. So that's why something like 2008 to 2024 is a big enough scale. So that's, I think, something like 100. Let's see, that's gonna be like 150, 160 different teammate pairings. So it's a really good sample size. So you're not gonna have as many issues if you do it on that big of a scale. Now, for finishing position, this one's pretty simple. You just take the Z score of the finishing position difference, and we don't really do any special modifications here. So you just take the finishing position 2 minus finishing position 1, and that way, if it's a lower value for the lead driver, in this case driver 1, it will be a positive. So that way, when you calculate the Z score, it will still be in the positive direction. So 0.2, you calculate the Z score. In our case, that's a 0.106. So for the last one, this will require a little bit of explanation as well. And so this is a Z score of the adjusted standard starting position, finishing position difference. And the reason that this is involved is I think I do think it's a relevant metric, saying how much a driver progresses from their starting position to their finishing position. But that being said, you can't take the raw value, and these charts will kind of explain why. So using all that data from 2008 to 2024, if you kind of plot a driver's average starting position with the finishing position, starting position delta, and you just take the raw values, you'll see that there is a bit of a correlation there. It's not super strong when the R-squared value is about 0.3, so not statistically significant or anything, but you can see for the average starting position when it's quite high, so drivers lower down the grid, it's almost always going to be above 2, above 3, and that is because every race, especially in the past, you're going to lose drivers to mechanical issues. You're going to have crashes, and so even if you have a really reliable car, even if you're very, very slow, you can start 20th in a race and you can move up to 16th, 17th pretty consistently. So it's something that you do have to control for, because you are going to have drivers who qualify out of position. You know, looking at, you know, your Lance Strolls, Perez at Red Bull, I think would be two pretty good examples of that. And because you have that correlation between starting position and starting position, finishing position delta, you also have a very strong correlation between average starting position and your constructor's rank. So really like a rough placement of how strong a car is, which, you know, makes a whole lot of sense. The fastest cars in the races generally qualify at the front of the grid. So, you know, not rocket science there. But what you can do is you can take the line of best fit for both of these kind of plots, and you can basically plug a driver's, plug a bunch of numbers in, and it'll give you kind of an adjusted starting position, finishing position difference. And this is to account for drivers who qualify poorly. So it kind of builds in this expectation that if you qualify outside of out of position, that you should be able to you know, improve a certain amount. And on the flip side, if you're a driver who's an exceptional qualifier, but your team's a little bit slower, you know, it does make a little bit of sense that you perhaps would fall back a little bit in the races. So it's basically a buffer against that as well. So this is the equation for it. The data is a little bit different from the ones on the graphs. The graphs, I think, are the most up to date, but the equation, I think, is only from 2008 to 2003. I haven't adjusted them yet, but again, with more every year, you know, the changes are going to be smaller and smaller. So in this equation, you basically take the delta minus 0.158 times SP minus 0.16 minus SP minus the other line of best fit, which is 1.53 times C plus 2.23, where delta is the standard, not the standard, starting position, finishing position difference. SP is the average starting position for that driver, and C is the constructor's rank. And this is a value that's not paired. So for the last two values, the points and finishing position, they're basically paired. So the value, the Z-score value for one driver will be the opposite of their teammates. So for example, driver one, their points Z-score was 0.4. That means for the other driver, for their teammate, it would be negative 0.4. Whereas for overtake, the unique thing about that is that it's not paired. So it's possible for both drivers to have a positive, it's possible for both drivers to have a negative score. But in the context of the fact that we're only using this data to compare teammates, it's not really a big deal that if you have both positives and both negatives, because what we do at the end is we basically just subtract the values from each other and then divide by 2. So if you put the numbers for driver 1, driver 2 into this equation, for driver 1, 0.628, and driver 1, 0.628, driver 2, 0.618. So not a big difference there, but I wasn't really, you know, I obviously made the data myself, and this was not the stat that I was trying to, you know, highlight the difference. If you were to take an example like taking data from Perez and Verstappen and putting that in, you would see a massive difference comparing just the raw starting position, finishing position, and using this adjusted equation. So when we look, going back to our original example, so points Z-score for driver 1, 0.4, finishing position 0.106, and then overtake 0.375. So we've calculated our 3 different Z-scores, and then what we do is we just take the average of the 3, and you subtract the driver 2 total, subtract from the driver 2 total to kind of get a delta score. So for driver 1, 0.294 is your final average. Let me just check if that's correct. And then for driver 2, negative 0.046. You subtract the 2 and the delta score is 0.340 in driver's 1 favor. And what you would do is you would basically calculate this for driver 1 and then calculate for driver 2. And if your calculations are correct, the calculation for driver 2 should just be the inverse of the negative of what the calculation for driver 1 is. And I think this is, you know, a pretty useful way of, you know, assessing driver performance in the race. The reason you want to have more than one stat is it kind of puts guardrails on it. So if you have, for whatever reason, one of the stats is is a bit of an outlier, having the others there kind of make it so that it kind of controls for those outlier effects. It means that your final value is not going to be as potentially as misleading as having the different factors there all together. Now, just kind of a related topic, and this is something that I'm planning on implementing, and that is, an alternative point system. Like I showed you before with the Kubica-Russell model, or Kubica-Russell example from 2019, the modern F1 point system, the 25-point system that we've had in place since 2010, is not the best, especially for back markers and for teams in the lower midfield, as it means that fluke results tend to be what decides those points battles between teammates. And that's why I've been I'm planning on implementing alternative point systems simply for the model. Of course, in videos like, doing this statistical analyses comparing teammates, I wouldn't use these numbers because they're kind of meaningless to the average viewer. But I do think that they are a little bit better for assessing lower midfield and for back marker drivers. And this is basically one that I've seen from F1 analysis. So they've used this in their own model, and I've kind of taken the same decay, and I'm trying to implement it in mine to see if it works. And basically, you would give 10 points to the winner, and then for every position below that, you would give basically 72% of the position before it. So the second place would get 7.2 points, and then third place would get about 5, and then you would just keep doing the calculation all the way till the end, which is in today's F1 is 20. And I do think it's an interesting way to look at, calculate points difference between teammates. So, for example, if you take the Russell Kubica example I gave, of course, Kubica scored 1 point, Russell none, but using this alternative point system, Kubica would have scored 1.438 points, whereas for Russell, 1.969. And that, I think, is a better reflection of the fact that a better reflection of reality, in the sense that I think Russell was the better driver in races, in race pace that season. So there you go. There's my explanation of my race model, and just kind of going through an in-depth breakdown. I know we had I think in a couple of videos there's been some questions about what it is, but now that this video is there, I can just kind of point people in this direction in case they're interested and want to hear about it. So if you're still watching, if you've watched this for all 22 minutes of it, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy more of this, please subscribe. It would really help things out, and I really like talking about stats, and especially in F1. So again, thanks for watching. Goodbye.